And welcome back to Sullivan's Unheard Voices. I am here with the man with many names and many talents. Like it's either TJ or help me out here.
Timothy James.
Timothy James.
Those are the main two.
Those are the main two. And what I love about that is that you have a slightly different persona as you approach the stage based on whether it's Timothy James or TJ Wong. And I can appreciate the nuances because the way you play is slightly different for both. And I don't know if a lot of people pick up on that, but it's you can tell there's just a slight variation in like how much funk is in the music when you play under TJ Wong as you do Timothy James. And I appreciate that so much. Like,
Thank you.
How did you get started? Because like you were hands down one of the best guitar players I have ever heard in my entire life. Like your technical precision along with your ability to like maintain the flow and just like, when did you get started?
So when I was 9, well, no, let's back up further than that. When I was like 6 or 5 or 6, I started taking piano lessons. And I took them for a couple of years. And then after a while, I decided it wasn't for me.
Yeah.
Probably by the time I was 8 or so, I think, or 7 or 8. And then when I was 9, I became kind of like, I had a knack. I wanted to play the guitar.
Yeah.
I told my dad, because we had this big party we'd do every year. We called it the Malino Blues Festival down in Malino. And I told him I want to play a song with you. And so I kind of started working, and I learned 4 chords, I guess. And I played Knocking on Heaven's Door that year with him. That was the first song I ever learned. It was not Smoke on the Water, unlike,
right?
But basically, after that, I kind of just, for a while there, I think it was just kind of a hobby, right?
Yeah.
And then once you get into middle school, you start looking for a social identity. And I think I really clung to the guitar at that point because everyone had something they were doing, whether it was sports or, I don't know. I mean, it's middle school, right? So you come into those kind of pre-teenage years and teenage years, and you start to want to be identifiable by something. And so I got into guitar, and I clung onto it, and that was my thing. And it stuck, I guess.
At what point did you know that you were starting to pick up on it at a proficient enough level to actually venture out on your own? Like, do you remember like a shift? Like, I know I'm really good at this point.
Probably, I think when I was 11 or 12, like 6th grade, right? So we're getting out of middle school. I started to realize that, A, I really, really enjoyed it. And B, I did feel like I had... maybe a natural, I don't know. I hesitate to use talent, right? But a gift, towards it.
But you can't get away from that, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that it's the talent part is there, right? But you can't discredit how much work it takes to develop that talent, right? So the two go hand in hand.
They do, and you can have a gift, but unless you put the time in, then. It's just a gift, and it's not, a fully fledged, whatever it could be, right?
and the last time I saw you play was at a cafe, and you had a bass player join you, like just sort of out of the blue. And the part that I appreciate you as a musician is you have this way of communicating what's needed so that this bass player who may not even know the actual entire song can figure it out based on the signals and the information that you give them. That is a talent in of itself. And I was so impressed by that. Just like that subtlety of like, I got you. I got you.
Yes, I remember that. That was Kevin Kelly,
Yep.
Who plays with Nicky Jones
Yep.
and Taylor Newville and all sorts of people. But yeah, I remember he showed up and I was like, I just looked up and Kevin was there. Oh, well, Kevin's got to get up and play now.
Right.
And I go, do you have your stuff? He goes, well, no, but I live 5 minutes from here. I'm like, great, you've got your stuff then.
So does that happen like all the time?
It's pretty common, especially in the blues world when most of the music is improv based and improvisational. Yeah. If I'm using that word right. And I think that is, again, music in itself is maybe a gift or a natural talent, but one of the skills learned
Yeah.
is certainly to be able to improvise, because it takes a lot of flexibility, and you do have to understand that, okay, this person's never played this song before. What information do I need to give them to be able to have us both be successful? Yeah,
so take me through the process of you deciding on how to launch TJ Wong, for example.
Yes. Okay.
Like, what was the story behind that? Because I think it's so awesome.
So for years, and I still do, I perform as Timothy James, and that's always been, it's leaned more towards singer-songwriter and pop, and really my strength there is songwriting, and that's what I like to lean into, and songwriting and storytelling and that kind of thing. And a couple of years ago, Tim and I were talking, and we wanted to go back to the International Blues Challenge in Memphis. And I told him, I said, I don't want to go back as Timothy James because it's just confusing for people. Because there were times when I'd go play a show, and it was unclear whether I was going to play blues or I was going to play my pop stuff. You know, it was just very unclear. And so I told him, I said, what if we came up with an alter ego?
Yeah.
And we started kind of joking about it, and I said, you call me TJ Wong. And he said, that's it. And so that kind of stuck. And so back in, I want to say 2023, we went to Memphis as the TJ Wong Trio. And then in 2024, Alec Dawn and I went as a duo. So TJ Wong and Alec Dawn. We joke and call ourselves the Wong Dawn duo.
I love it.
But yeah, it kind of came out of necessity, really, to be able to differentiate between the bluesier stuff I was doing and the more singer-songwriter oriented pop stuff that I was doing. So.
And one of the things that I appreciate, a few of the songs off your last album, just how wonderfully crafted it is from the guitar aspect of it, because like I try to like keep up with your fingers, and there's no way that I can. Like what prompted you? So like some guitarists prefer like the use of a pick, and I know that you don't normally use a pick.
I go back and forth.
Back and forth.
Yeah.
Like what prompts the decision about whether or not? I've always was curious about that.
So first, I'll say I started using a pick right when I was learning guitar, and then at some point, I think I must have been 13 or 14 or somewhere around there, I just stopped using a pick. I don't know why. I think maybe it was inconvenient to always have to have a pick or something. Maybe it was out of necessity. And then that kind of became my style, and I definitely have a lot of finger control, which is really cool, and I can actually play like faster without a pick than with a pick, which is unique because, obviously a lot of guitar players are really quick with a pick, and I'm the other way around. I'm pretty slow with a pick. But at one point, a couple years ago, especially once I started producing and doing session guitar work and that kind of thing, it really became a necessity to be able to switch stylistically.
Yeah.
Because although the fingers are great for the singer-songwriter stuff and for jazz and for even the blues, when I wanted to play the heavier stuff, which I would play a lot of the time, and people would ask me to play, hey, can you play this hard rock solo, it just wouldn't really work with my fingers because there's not enough attack there on the guitar. And so you play it, and it's almost this kind of, it's beautiful. It's a tender feeling, kind of thing, and it's maybe more muted. But with a pick, it's just like, there's all this attack in your face, right? And so, especially for the TJ Wong record, there was a lot that I didn't use a pick for, but I think there was also maybe an equal amount that I said, you know what, this needs to be really aggressive sounding, and stylistically I need to use a pick so I can punch them in the face with my music.
I appreciate that. In a couple of your songs, when they start out with the solo that you have, it does. It's one of those punch you in the face like, holy cow, this is going to be epic. Yeah.
Lightning in a bottle, right?
Yeah, but and and I want to make sure that we distinguish that. Where am I going with this? Yes, I appreciate that aspect of it. However, you yourself are on a level that very few musicians that I've run into or talked to that have this ability to sing the lyrics and to sing the way you do and to still play at the same time. Like that is a talent in of itself.
Thank you.
Like I know a lot of guitar players that are amazing, but they can't do both at the same time.
Multitasking.
Yeah. Like, did you develop that over time, or is that just kind of
just again, it was an overtime thing and maybe a necessity because when you play with a trio, you have to fill space, and you can't afford to take a break playing guitar when you're singing.
Yeah,
and so you've kind of got to fill as many roles as you can, really, and it's odd. That's kind of been my career thus far is filling as many roles as I can. Again, out of the love of music, but also out of necessity. When you want to do music full time, it's difficult to say, okay, I'm going to play guitar for a living, right? And it's doable, and there are people who do it, and I have a ridiculous amount of respect for them. But I found it easier to say, okay, I'm going to do music for a living, and that means I play guitar, I sing, I produce other people's records, I engineer, I do live sound when it pays well enough, because live sound is kind of a nightmare sometimes, or can be, and then I give guitar lessons and all this stuff, and really, at this point in my life, and maybe at the tail end of it, but the more you can do, the better.
Yeah.
Any
opportunity you can to get your name out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about like all of this creativity that you have and like the other aspects of it, I would imagine it also helps you when it comes to creating the album pieces because you have an idea in your head of all of these different arrangements that you can sort of bring to the table as well.
So this last record was different than anything I've ever done because most of the songs Tim and I co-wrote.
Yeah.
And so what would happen is we'd sit down and, sometimes I'd have an idea and I'd bring it to him and say, hey, what do you think of this? He'd be like, that's great. Let's add a cool riff here. I'm like, okay. And I think I wrote all the lyrics and a lot of the, maybe the chord structures. But Timmer really pushed me to say, hey, make sure you show off your guitar skills here. Because, for me, it's like, especially when you're making a record, you want to be tasteful about it. And especially like a singer-songwriter record, you don't just have a bunch of guitar chops. It's more about the song. And on this record, we definitely pushed more like, okay, let's show off a little bit on the guitar, right? Because that's what people want to hear in this particular genre. So.
And I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the sense that you're more humble than most musicians. And I would imagine that Timmer may have had to push you towards more guitar solos because you have this talent and it should showcase, but at the same time, that inner dialogue of like, I'm not that good, I'm not that, but you are.
Well, it's like it's kind of contradicting to say you are humble. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I have to tread lightly there. But yeah, I my belief is that I'm just a vessel for the creativity. You know what I mean? And all of really, I mean we've all got hours into it, but really the whole thing is a gift, and it's just something we should share with others and
100%
give back, really.
Right. And I can't imagine a community without music.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Like how lame would that be?
Totally weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'd have to resort to abstract paintings or something. Here, I made this painting for you. So
when you were nominated and you received the award from the Blues Association.
So I was nominated last year.
Yeah.
And I didn't win.
Okay.
And I've been nominated this year. And this is funny. Again, going back to I really try to be humble and I try to really always check myself. And because I really do believe that most of the people I get to play with are better than me. And I think that's the way I view it, is that I'm just blessed and really fortunate to be put in a position to be able to play alongside people like Brandon Logan and stuff. And really, I just watch them and I go, oh my gosh, like maybe someday I'll be like that, But it was kind of funny. My dad was giving me a hard time because we all sat down as a family and we voted for our Muddy nominations. And he's like, all right, vote for yourself. I'm like, I cannot vote for myself.
What?
I was like, I don't feel right about that. And so I ended up voting for one of the other guys. Because, again, I just think they're so much more deserving, in my opinion. And they're just great, And they really are my role models.
Yeah.
And, again, when I hear them play, people like Ben Rice or Alan Hager, I'm like, Alan. In fact, yesterday I had a session in here. I was recording Alan Hager on some tunes. Who's Curtis Salgado's guitar player. And we were in between doing something, and I turn around, he's just playing guitar, and it's just like, it's just effortless, He's just sitting there like he might as well be just breathing, you know what I mean? Like, anyway, so that's how I view it, and again, I'm just I'm just a vessel for the gift. So.
And I think a lot of people don't understand just like the history of blues and the history of music in the Portland area.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand the amount of talent that's here.
Yeah.
There are a lot of good musicians around.
And it's interesting because it is a small demographic, but it is a massive part of Portland.
Yeah.
And if you look back, some of my favorite videos to watch, I think from like the late 80s, early 90s, are the Mayor's Ball in Portland. And they would hire people like Curtis Salgado to come play and Paul DeLay and that kind of people. And there's videos on YouTube you can look up Mayor's Ball like 1988 or whatever. But it's just it's fascinating, you know, and it's interesting how it's almost forgotten in a sense.
Yeah.
And how it is a niche thing, even though back then it was a massive part of Portland history. But in the grand scheme of things, I think overall you can look and see that Portland, especially in the 90s, was really it was an amazing music scene.
Yeah.
And it's changed. I really think it has because of COVID and because of, you could say, because of streaming and all that other stuff. But it is interesting to look at the history of it and see how in the 90s you had bands like Everclear and Sheryl Crow did records here and all these big bands. And that it's not the same as it used to be.
Yeah.
I think those were almost the I wasn't born, so what I have to say, but those were almost the golden days in the industry, because I think the other thing about the 90s is the record companies had a lot more money to throw around, and so they'd pick up these acts and say, yeah, let's do a 5-record deal with them. You know what I mean?
And there used to be a lot more record labels out there too.
Yes, 100%.
Like there's just, it seems to be like
now,
and so it's a smaller piece of the pie for the smaller number of artists.
Even the big bands, the big popular bands nowadays. There's an artist I really love. Her name's Lizzie McAlpine, and she's out of, I think, the Boston area. She went to Berklee College of Music, but she's one of the biggest artists around nowadays. I mean, as big as you can be nowadays because of the lack of monoculture and all that stuff. But she's an independent artist, and she sells out. You know, I mean, I saw her at the Moda Center last year, and it was pretty much full. You know, so it's kind of like our culture's moving in a really interesting direction. Where back in the 80s and 90s, you said, "Oh, I love Bon Jovi, I love Pearl Jam." Later on, right? And everybody knew who those people were. And nowadays, you can name 10 artists that have millions of streams. Yeah. And people don't know who they are. Yeah. You know, it's like, it's really interesting in the age of the internet, and monoculture is no more. And everyone has their own niche thing, and it's, different times.
And do you think, like, and what I'm starting to see, and I don't know if you're seeing the same thing, I'm starting to see a little bit more people coming out now. And like every time I go out, there seems to be like 10 more or 5 more, and it's like, I think there's a chance this is going to come back soon.
Yeah. And I think in the post-COVID world, between that and then also, you know, it's hard to say overall, but with TikTok going away potentially and all these other things, I'm hoping that especially my generation gets back into live music. Because back in the day, people would say, I have a Friday night off, or, you know, I have Friday night or Saturday night, whatever. I'm going to go see some live bands. And as far as I know, nobody in my generation does that anymore unless, A, it's a really big artist, or B, they're friends with the person. The person says, hey, you should come out and see my band, you know? But it seems like my generation isn't looking for live music like maybe 30 years ago. You know?
And I even think it's my generation as well. Like, because like I love going out and seeing bands, and it's always a difficult thing for me to find people who want to come out and go with me. Because most of my friends, they just want to stay home and, like you say, scroll TikTok for 6 hours. And like I'm done with that. Like I've realized over the last year, like how much of a time suck and all of that the social media is, and I'm like, I could be going out and meeting musicians and like talking to people and enjoying this amazing music right here in my backyard, or I can watch 15-second clips of cats, and it's like, I'm done with the cats, man. I'm done with the cats. But I keep going back to TikTok.
It's tough, Dude,
it's
everybody
tough.
loves cats. Even if you hate cats, you know, cats are good to good to watch. Good entertainment.
And so, like, in terms of live music, though, right? And one of the things that I've talked to a bunch of people about is how much you need to work in order to be self-sufficient in music. Because it's not like the days of you can put a band together and you can be solely relying on live gigs. It seems to be like the pay has not increased with the inflation and everything else. It just seems have you seen the same kind of thing?
So it's interesting if we look at the actual how things have changed since the 70s. Back in the 70s, you had bands like Steely Dan, which were primarily studio bands. And back then, everybody was buying records.
Yeah.
And so they didn't actually have to play live, really. I mean, because they would make a record and it'd sell millions of records, and that's how they made their money. And they could go on tour if they wanted to. And especially, I think a lot of bands did, because obviously they love performing, in your band. But we've seen this change where people are no longer buying records, they're streaming. And so, you're not making any money actually from releasing a record anymore. And B, you're right, the pay hasn't gone up for musicians at all.
Yeah.
Everyone else has seen, pay increases that are equal to inflation. Whereas musicians have been getting paid $100 a gig forever. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to guys who were gigging in the 70s, and they said, back in the day we made $100 a night. And in the 70s, that was good money. I mean, again, you could always argue that there's not as much stability in the gigging thing. But even, I've talked to buddies who've done research, and back in the 30s and 40s, when musicians did this full time, they were still making, sometimes a couple $100 a night, which back then was a lot of money. You know what I mean? So it's interesting, and I think again a lot of that is to do with no more monoculture, and also just our culture has become less social too. Everything is social media, which is really not social media. It's anti-social media.
It's isolation in a different form.
Yeah, totally. So it's really interesting, and I think we're at an interesting spot in our culture, and eventually there's probably going to be a breaking point. We'll see that things will turn around.
Because I like to look at it as just like from an economics of time thing, right? Back in, like, even when the 1990s, right? $100, I was making $5 an hour. Yeah. So at $100, it sort of made sense at $5 an hour. Now the average wage is $15, $20. Yeah. So if you're talking about $100, you're playing for what, 3-4 hours? Yeah. So you're making less than minimum wage.
You are.
For a talent and a work ethic that takes a huge, considerable amount of your life. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't understand how that sort of shakes out.
Yeah. And again, it's interesting. I've been fortunate. I'm at a spot where I have a minimum, and I usually try to get $200 to $250 a gig. Yeah. It just came to a point in my life where I said, I've been doing this long enough. I can call myself a professional. And there's nothing wrong with someone offering me a $100 gig, and I just tell them, sorry, I can't afford to do that. That's the truth. I can't afford to do that. And I tell them my minimum is $200 or $250 or whatever it is. And they just have to be okay with that, so.
And I appreciate that you do that, because I think collectively it helps everybody.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Because other people see that that's possible, and the more people that sort of do that, it sort of shifts things up a little bit. Yeah. And I appreciate that the sense of collective and community. One of the things that I always appreciate about musicians, and we kind of touched about it earlier, is how much of a sense of family it is. And like. And I don't know if this was always the case, but recently I have seen time and time and time again, when something happens, the musician community comes together and rallies behind people in support, as opposed to sitting over there going, ha, ha, ha. Yeah. And I don't know if that's just blues, but I've seen that more over in the last year and a half, 2 years than I have ever before.
I'd say there's definitely pockets of communities that do that, and the blues is really good at that. I think the blues is probably one of the best I've seen. When something happens to somebody, instantly there's some sort of fundraiser or benefit. Yeah. And it can happen in other genres for sure, but a lot of the time, people seem to get really competitive, and that's all they care about, and then something bad happens to someone else, and they go, okay, this is my chance, instead of saying this is my chance to help, they say this is my chance to get ahead, which is unfortunate. But the blues is really, really has always been very supportive. So.
How did you get to blues in of itself? Like, so you're here, you are talented, you're growing up, and how did you shift? Like, the blues is where I want to go.
So it was interesting. I grew up listening and playing to classic rock, and that was always just what I had loved. And then I think at some point I kind of started going to open mics, and then I heard about the open jam down at the Trails End Saloon in Oregon City. And so I remember we went down there, and basically they were like, all right, this is a blues jam. But, I would play like Jimi Hendrix and stuff.
Yeah.
And then little by little I started to understand more that the blues was really the basis of all this stuff. And so I kind of started taking lessons from Ken Brewer, and I learned a lot of stuff from that. I took lessons from Timmer, and I kind of learned my way around the blues per se. And little by little I got more comfortable in it, and then it's just it's become a family for me and a community that a lot of other places don't have, a lot of other genres don't have. And so again, we're really fortunate in Portland here. We have a really great blues community, and there are other places that like Seattle has a great blues community, but it's definitely not as big, I don't think, and maybe not as welcoming. And I say that not against the blues people, but a lot of the venues are hard to get into. You talk to venues and they say, well, can you sell out a room? Well, no. But in Portland, it seems like there's always been an opportunity, and the venues are really supportive, and they want to help. They want to get you on your feet, and if you're a young kid especially, they want you to succeed. So
and I think there's a difference in culture there too, right? Because I'm originally from Seattle, and the Seattle freeze is a thing. Yeah. Like, I remember living in the same place for 10 years, and I only knew one of my neighbors. Not for me lack of trying, it's just that the community there, they just don't care. And that seems to be the culture in Seattle. And so contrast that, since I've been in Salem in the Portland area, like, I feel welcome here. Like, people are friendly, people like hug each other, people are like supportive, and like the conversations are way different. And I love that about this place. And so, like, once you start, like, you remember the first time you got on stage?
One of them, yes.
Yeah. What was that like?
Well, I think it's interesting. Again, back then I would have looked at it less serious and more of a hobby.
Yeah.
But I think once I started doing it more and more, I realized, like, okay, this is like, not only do I really enjoy this and is it fun, but I can really connect with people this way. And again, I think at the end of the day, I think that's something we're all looking for, and that just happens to be the thing that I really love doing. And some people are comedians and some people are graphic artists, but we all want to connect with people. Yeah. And so I specifically remember the first bar gig I played, and I was 12 years old. And, I grew up in Malino, and there's this slightly bigger town called Malala right next to it. And there's this kind of row downtown of, like, all these dive bars. And we had this old family friend that we knew. His name's Easy Eddie Campy, and he played with Curtis Salgado back in the day. And, awesome. And he was living in Malala at the time. And he said, well, he's like this old crusty dude. He's like, all right, well, why don't you get up and play with us? Come. And okay. So I went through the back door of this bar, and I think we played like Cocaine by Eric Clapton, and then I'm like 12, right? Mustang and Sally, and all just that kind of stuff. And there were these like drunk, not middle-aged women, older than middle-aged, maybe in their 50s and 60s. They started throwing money at me, and at that point I was like, all right, I think I know what I want to do. No, but Eddie pulled me aside and he said, listen, there are some things you need to know. You got to learn to play the blues a little better and understand the progression. And so that's really right after that's when I learned like a 12-bar blues was, and all this stuff. But I remember that being a turning point for sure, and saying, wow, that was really fun. And and obviously I don't want to be stuck in bars the rest of my life,
Right.
And I am moving away from that, surely, but that was a turning point. Wow, people really connect with this, and again, that was right around. I must have been in 7th or 8th grade. That was that turning point of saying, okay, this is my identity.
That's awesome.
So, yeah.
And you said that you needed to learn 12-bar
12-bar blues, yes.
Tell people what that is, because a lot of people don't know.
So, essentially, basically, like, should I grab a guitar?
It's up to you. Go for it. Uh-huh. Now we're in for a real treat, y'all.
For a real treat, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, in blues music, probably the most common progression is the 12-bar, which means you have a total of 12 bars of music that repeat themselves, mostly in tune. Let me move that mic down. So, one, two, three, four, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. This is number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? And then it just repeats from there. So really, it's this very standardized thing, and everyone can say, hey, we're in the key of A or E or whatever, and we're going to play a 12-bar. And they go, okay, and everyone knows the chords, right? And so it's this universal thing of once you know what these things mean, 12-bar, or there's different endings,
Yeah.
And they may say, okay, instead of a 5 to 4, it's going to go a 6 to 5 or whatever.
Okay.
And it's just all these different things that maybe seem complicated to people who don't know what they are, but once you learn them, they're universal. And so you go, okay, it's like saying take a left and then a right and then another left. Everyone knows what that means, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's kind of what the 12-bar is. And again, Easy Eddie pulled me aside and he said, listen, you got to learn a 12-bar and you got to learn it in every key. I'm like, okay. And so I did. And so now, again, you go anywhere in the world that has a blues jam and they say, okay, 12-bar in G. And you know exactly what to do, right? And there's all these other, little things like the style. Stylistically, there's a shuffle or a rumba or, all this different stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of...
So what do you mean when you say shuffle?
Okay, so shuffle... Now we're getting detailed. You should ask a drummer about this, because I'm very layman in my terms.
Yeah.
And not very...
Here's the thing, though,
theory
TJ,
based.
right?
Yeah.
Everybody listening is also at that level.
Perfect.
Right? So
Perfect.
you are good.
Basically, all they are is they're just different rhythmic variations, and they're all 12 bars, but you have different patterns. So, for example, if we have a rumba, it sounds like this. So that's kind of the rhythm behind it. A shuffle would be more like... It's almost like a lumpty feeling kind of thing, right? So that's a shuffle. And then the thing is, it's funny. Inside of the shuffle category, you have like all these different shuffles.
Yeah.
Because in different areas of, especially in the U.S., right? You have Chicago. You have more Delta style. There's just all these different styles of things where people know the shuffle as a different name, even sometimes, like a box shuffle versus a lumpty. We call it a lumpty up here, but that's kind of a Northwest thing, I think. And everyone else calls it a box shuffle, I think is what I was told. But basically, you have all these different variations on stuff, and depending on which part of mostly the U.S. that you came from, then it's gonna sound different.
And the reason I asked this question, right, is because I'm getting this picture now of like you're having to maintain. And we'll wait for a second here. We're having to maintain numbers in your head while you're maintaining lyrics, while you're maintaining riffs, all of this going on at the exact same time.
Yeah. And I tell people, a lot of the time people go, wow, that's really complicated.
Yeah.
And it is in a sense, but again, once it's muscle memory, it's muscle memory.
Yeah.
And so when I teach theory, music theory, it can basically all be boiled down to 1 through 7 because there's only
Okay.
in a major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Well,
Yeah.
do and do are the same, so there's really not 8 notes. There's 7. And obviously, once you get more into it, there's half steps, which makes it so that there's actually 12 notes. But the thing is, again, it's at the end of the day, it's like once you learn it, it's all muscle memory. And so you can quickly communicate using that. So.
And so, like, once you get to that muscle memory point, that's when you get to start to play. Right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, you could play it before that, but that's when you get.
I mean, like, play with the rules a little bit is what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, once you have the 12 countdown, then you can start to throw in those half beats and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Like, just the idea of doing that on stage just freaks me out. Like, I could do this podcast stuff all day long, but getting up on a stage, there's just no way.
And to me, I'm like, I think the people I have the biggest respect for are drummers.
Yeah.
Because, even though us, guitar players and piano players, whatever, we multitask because we have to sing and we have to play and all that stuff at once and remember things. The drummers have to use all 4 limbs, which it's crazy to me. And what's even crazier is that there are singing drummers, So I really have a lot of respect for drummers. And there's so many different, styles and there's these nuances that nobody really talks about, but anyway, it's crazy.
How hard is it to find a good drummer these days?
That it's hard to say. It's so personal for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm really, really picky. But I've been fortunate, and they've just landed in my lap a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
well, that drummer that you had in that live album recording that's on live with you and Timmer.
Oh, on the PNC Live Studio? Yeah. Alec, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that's just a machine.
Yeah.
So I met Alec because I used to play in this band years ago that was a cover band, and we were all young kids between the ages of like 12 and 18 or so, maybe 17. And Alec joined after I left. I left the group because I was like, I really want to play more original music. I want to focus on that. And they said, okay. So I left the group, and then Alec joined shortly after that to play drums. And then they ended up coming, and I produced their first record, like an EP. And so Alec played on it, and I just thought, man, he's really good, And there's not a lot of young drummers who can especially play to a click that well. It's really hard to play to a click. And so I told him, I said, if I ever need a drummer, can I call you? And he said, well, sure. And so we ended up playing a couple gigs together, and then, ever since then, he's been my main guy pretty much. And so it's been really cool to watch him grow, because originally, he when I first met him, he was playing in like punk bands and stuff.
Yeah.
And he was very skilled, but I remember he used to play really, really loud, and little by little, he kind of started to understand, I think. I don't even remember having a conversation with him. Maybe in the studio I did once, but really it was just he kind of started to understand, okay, his dynamics increased, and he wasn't just playing loud all the time. He was playing everywhere in between loud.
So
and
it's that transition to be able to understand as a drummer that you don't have to hit as hard every single time.
Yeah. And it's not even just like, it's not even loud and soft. Dynamics can mean how many notes you're playing too. So it's really multi-dimensional in that kind of area. And it's crazy. Every drummer is different, even more than guitar players or any other instrumentalist. I think drummers are some of the most varied.
Yeah.
And even if 2 drummers play the exact same thing, it's going to sound different,
100%.
no matter what. Yeah.
100%. That's my experience 100% of the time.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting. But again, I've been really fortunate, and Alec is my main guy, and he's my favorite drummer to work with.
He is amazing.
Yeah, he is. He's a machine.
Yeah. And what's the biggest crowd size you've played for to date?
That's a tough one. Depends who you ask. I've played in front of probably a couple thousand at the waterfront, I would guess. I played Cathedral Park Jazz Festival one year, and I was told it was like 5,000.
Like?
The Cathedral Park Jazz Festival?
Yeah.
Well, it was dark. It was kind of in the evening, so you couldn't see everybody. But I was told there was like 5,000 people there. I don't know how true that is.
Yeah.
And it's hard to see, because it's under the bridge and it goes up and up that hill.
But I hear the acoustics are amazing there.
I remember them being pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
was young. I think I was 16, maybe 17. So I don't exactly remember. But it was a really great experience. And someday I'd like to go back and play it again. It was good. It was really good.
And then what's coming up next for you?
Okay. So right now, I'm working on the next Timothy James record, and I'm working with this really great producer out of Dallas, Texas, who used to live in West Lynn here, actually. And we're working on a record, and I don't know when it's going to be out. And people keep asking me that. Last night I had two people, hey, when is your record coming out? I have no idea. As much as I'd love to put a date on it, it's just there's too many variables because it's just, my producer's mixing it, and he's got a lot of other stuff going on right now, which is totally cool. I have no issue with that. And so he's just kind of getting to it when he can, and it's totally worth it because I love his work. So I'm like, I'm not going to, it's no rush. Just take your time and make it how we want it to sound.
And you want to make sure that it's right.
And you want to make sure that's right because there's been times in the past where, excuse me, where we'll cut that part out. No, we'll bleep it out. No, there's been times where I work on something and I release it and I just go, I should have put my foot down because whoever I was working with said, no, we're going to do it this way. And I wasn't maybe entirely comfortable with that, and I wasn't maybe happy with the end result. But at the time, I was just like, well, it's fine.
Yeah.
So at this point in my career, I'm definitely saying it's got to be quality, and sometimes quality over quantity.
Yeah.
And so I've toyed with the idea of just putting an EP out next instead of a full record. We'll see. But after that, I'd like to put out another TJ Wong record, like a full-length, maybe 10-song record.
That would be badass.
Should be really cool. I'd love to do that. Again, it's a time constraint. Everything's a time constraint. But that'd be really cool. I'm playing the NAMM show down in Anaheim on January 25th. I'm not sure when this is going to come out. But that's going to be really cool. And then other than that, I recently got married, so I'm really trying to focus. Thank you. I'm really trying to focus on my wife and for a long time, I just worked like 7 days a week and it was always just the grind, and I'd take time off when I could, but it wasn't very often,
Yeah.
And I'm at a point in my life where I'm ready to say, okay, let's rethink the work-life balance kind of thing. 'Cause you know what? At the end of the day, you only get to live once, and if I take a week off to go do something with my family, I'm not going to ever regret it. You know what I mean?
Oh, 100%.
So you can't buy the memories back. And that's what I keep telling myself is I'll take time off and something will come up, a gig will come up. But I just keep telling myself you cannot buy back the memories. It's just not, not something you can do.
You only get one trip around this planet.
That's right. Yeah.
And if you sacrifice that now, you can never get that back.
Yeah. So yeah, that's been kind of my life lately. But yeah, lots of traveling this year. It's gonna be fun. So
that's gonna be awesome.
Music and non-music related, but yeah.
I love that you have the ability to travel and not have it music related.
Yeah.
That's gonna be awesome.
It'd be cool.
And so like in terms of like how you start up, so like let's say you're gearing up for this next TJ Wong album.
Yeah.
What's the start of your process? Do you like lock yourself in a room and just sort of write, or just sort of as things come? Or?
It's interesting. A lot of things are as they come, but that can be difficult because when you do music full time, I find for myself, it's easy to get in a rhythm of not wanting to write.
Yeah.
Because, you get home from a long day of work or a long gig and you're like, man, I am exhausted. The last thing I want to do is think about music. And people, I think a lot of people maybe don't understand that. And there are musicians who still can they live and breathe music.
Yeah.
And I love music, but I'm not one of those people. And I have a lot of respect for those people. But for me, it's like, okay, man, my buddy's a plumber. He just got home from from snaking crap out of toilets. You know what I mean? And imagine he gets home and his wife goes, "Hey, honey, what do you want to do tonight? Can we go fix the plumbing?" You know, it's like, no, that's not. You don't want to do that. You know, and so for me, that's part of definitely my work-life balance is just saying, you know what, I worked a long day. Sometimes I feel like playing guitar, but a lot of the times it's just like, you know, I want to read or just hang out with my wife or whatever it may be, or work on my motorcycle. I don't know, you know. So for me, it's dangerous because if I say take things as they come very slowly. My ideas come very slowly. Sometimes I do have to just lock myself in a room and say, okay, this is record number 2 for TJ Wong. What do we want it to be? And so we've got to write the record. And then after that, we'll start to do demos and stuff. But yeah.
Do you start with like a riff or do you start with like a bass line? Like how do you normally,
So,
or does it depend?
For me, I'm either going to start with a guitar riff or a vocal line. And so different ones come differently. And it just depends.
Yeah.
And again, it's a case by case basis, but yeah, it's most of the time a vocal line / lyric or a guitar riff. Yeah.
And something I've always wanted to ask, at the end of the gig, right? Your end of the show, like, what do you want people who appreciated the show do? Like, do you want people to come up and like bombard you?
Yes.
If you're like, are you tired or like?
Okay, most of the time we're gonna. I've had some terrible gigs and people, frankly, they don't want to hear me. Right.
Right.
Sometimes, especially when you're younger and you're figuring out what you want to do, you play a gig at a dive bar and people are like, we were having this conversation earlier, I think. People are like, man, play Freebird or something.
Yeah.
We don't want to hear this singer-songwriter crap. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting. Most of the time, though, people are very supportive. And, you know, a lot of the time they won't come up and say something negative. I've had people say that. But most of the time, I want people to come up and talk to me. That's the biggest thing is I love meeting people.
Yeah.
And again, I keep coming back to it. We all want to connect with people. And so I love when people come up and say, man, I really like that one song, whether it's a cover or an original. You know, people say, I grew up listening to that song. Or they come up and say, was that an original tune? Because that reminded me of X. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting. I've had some really cool conversations and met some really great people. They come up and say, man, that song really reminded me of Dave Matthews or something. And I go,
what?
I was like, that's a new one. Thanks. Like, that's pretty cool, you know? So I love when people come up and talk to me. I think that's like the best thing ever. Because especially a lot of the time you play a gig and you feel like no one's listening. And that can be tough. And then at the end of the gig, you're like, man, that sucked. And I'm ready to go home. And then someone comes up and says, hey, man, I really love what you do. And I really appreciate that you do this or this. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
And what about things you wish people just would never do at a show? Because I'm always talking to people like be kind and like treat people with respect and like and one of the things I always like to impress upon people is like people are people.
Yeah.
And I don't like it when people are mean. I don't like it when people do disparaging things. And so it's like I just want people to know like there are some things that you just don't want to do to a musician.
Wow, that's tough. I like when people are understanding about they come up and they say, hey, can you play this obscure song? I'm like, I'm sorry, I do not know that song. And then they go, well, can you please just try to play it? I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I can't. It'll suck. It won't sound anything like that song. And so I've had that before. But other than that, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Be nice to your wait staff. That's the worst thing when you're sitting there playing and you can see someone getting in a snafu with the wait staff or whatever. It's just like, really? Like, don't be that guy.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Like that's already a thankless job where they don't make a lot of money and they have to put up a lot of garbage.
Yeah.
Like just be nice.
Love thy neighbor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, it's so simple, but sometimes we forget that, you know? And so I don't know. To me, as a musician personally, I hesitate to say this. Sometimes there's times when I'm like, okay, man, I wish these people would just shut up and listen.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get it because, you know, I play certain venues and it's not a listening room, right? And so people go to have a good time with their friends, and that's fine. But a lot of the time it's like, man, the biggest way you can compliment a musician is not tips. It's not following them on social media. It's just listening to them, you know? And so that's a big thing that can be tough when you're playing a gig and you're talking to the crowd and you're trying to talk the crowd up and nobody's listening to you. You're like, oh. Well, anyway, here's another, here's Wonderwall,
And I would imagine this situation sort of plays out, right? Because I've seen you live a few times now where you start out and the audience isn't engaged because they don't know you. They don't sort of have that. But then you see that shift. And I saw that the other night where all of a sudden people stop talking and they're like, oh, wait.
Yep.
This guy's really good.
Yeah.
And you see that shift change. And like people at a place that we were at and they get up and start dancing and like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's there's definitely been times, and it feels really good to take people by surprise because you get up there and they're just like, oh, he's gonna play wagon wheel or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you get up and you play your set, and people kind of start slowly go, oh, and they kind of start to shut up, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And that's a really cool feeling to take people by surprise. I don't know why it feels good, but it does, And so.
I always had a personal philosophy of like people where it's like, how would you describe yourself? I describe myself as the person you don't see coming. Because like I'm very unassuming, I'm very sort of in the pocket. But then if you get to know me, I'm like, oh, you did that? Like, hell yeah, I did that. I was able to accomplish that. You didn't know. Yeah. And so like I always there's a satisfaction for me anyway. When you're like, oh, you're the person that did that? Like, yes, I'm the person that brought sensory rooms to every visitation room in the state of Oregon. Like, I did that. But I don't want credit for it. I could care less.
And there's a beautiful thing in humility.
Yeah.
And because again, there's been shows where people start to play and they stop and they say, everybody shut up, you're here to listen to me. You know what I mean? Nobody wants to hear that.
That's going to have the opposite effect, I think.
Have the opposite effect, And so, personally, again, humility is the answer to a lot of it, and it's really cool to be able to just do your thing, and people go, oh, and frankly, if you're doing it right, you shouldn't have to gloat about yourself and all that stuff. So,
have you ever blown a string on stage?
Oh yeah, lots.
What do you do when that happens?
There's a really good video online of the TJ Wong trio in Memphis back in 2023. And we're playing, and we're like second or third song into the set, and I hit a string, and it just, and it just goes. And so I just kept playing, and then they started the next song, and I said, excuse me, and I just turned around and grabbed my other guitar. And you have to handle it as a professional.
Yeah.
There's this one band in Memphis that we saw that year, that did not make it to the finals because they were playing during the semifinals, and he's playing, and he breaks a string, and he got really frustrated, and it was towards the end of the set, and he was trying to tune his guitar, and his guitar wouldn't go into tune because the string broke, and it messes the whole thing up, right?
Yeah.
And so he's playing, and he's looking around for a spare guitar, and there's not one, and so he got off stage, and he threw his guitar down, and that's never a good look, you know what I mean? So you just have to say, okay, I broke a string. It is what it is. I can't unbreak it. You know what I mean? So you just have to say, okay, well, I brought my spare guitar. Let me put this one down. You know what I mean? So there's a really cool video of Stevie Ray Vaughan. He breaks a string. He's still playing. And he looks over, and his tech brings him a guitar, and he plays a note, and then he takes his guitar off in like half a second, hands it to the tech, grabs the other one, and starts playing as the tech is putting the strap on, right? And so he doesn't even miss a beat. So
that's epic.
Is like super cool. Again, why get angry at things that are out of our control? You know what I mean? There's no point.
How long does it take you to retune a guitar once a string breaks?
It depends on the guitar.
Okay.
But, some guitars, because the bridge is what we call floating bridge, which means it's held there by the tension of the strings.
Yeah.
And so you break a string, depending on what string you break, you could lose, a sixth or more of the tension, which is a lot. And so on a floating bridge guitar, you break a string and it's going to go wildly out of tune. It's not going to want to stay in tune.
Yeah.
But on other guitars, hardtail bridge guitars, you could play and break a string and it's not a huge deal. So it just depends. And some people will just change the string right there. They carry extra strings. I think that was more common back in the day.
Yeah.
And there's stories of like Eric Clapton doing that and stuff. Nowadays, I always bring, and most people always bring a spare guitar, just because you never know what's going to break on a guitar, and especially when you put it through its paces, like a lot of people do. Yeah, it's a wear item. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's just like your car. Flat tires, you can never really when they're going to happen or anything, same kind of thing. So,
and I would imagine it's less often for bass because of the thickness of the strings.
Yes. I don't know if I've ever seen anyone break a bass string. I've heard of people doing it, but the fact is they're so big and massive.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you even break that? It's like a suspension wire or a wire for a suspension bridge. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, we've been at this for over an hour.
Well,
TJ,
thank you. Yeah,
I would be honored to do this again.
Well, we will.
Yeah.
We will. That'd be cool.
Tell people how they can find your music.
Yes. So, I'm all over the streaming services, Apple Music and Spotify and all that. And my main singer-songwriter stuff is under Timothy James. And then the blues stuff is under TJ Wong. And so you can find me there. My website is timothyjamesmusic.com. And that's where all my shows are. If you're interested in audio engineering work or me co-producing your record with you, you can email timothyjamespdx@gmail.com. Or you can email that for any other questions you have or whatever. So,
and in closing, you all need to check this guy out when he's on stage. You will not be disappointed. And I guarantee you, I will put $50 on anybody that comes in there that sees you live and doesn't walk away totally blown away.
Thank you.
TJ, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.